Hey, it's Katie Phang on the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with Midas Touch. I know that you didn't miss this from cosplay Kristi Noem yesterday in a congressional hearing. Take a listen.
So, Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right
let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President Lincoln used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people. If not for that protection, the government could simply arrest people, including American citizens, and hold them indefinitely for no reason. Habeas corpus is the foundational right that separates free societies like America from police states like North Korea. As a senator from the live free or die state, this matters a lot to me and my constituents and to all Americans. So, Secretary Noem, do you support the core protection that habeas corpus provides, that the government must provide a public reason in order to detain and imprison someone?
Yeah, I support habeas corpus. I also recognize that the President of the United States has the authority under the Constitution to decide if it should be suspended or not.
It has never
Let us be clear, though,
it has never been done. It has never been done without approval of Congress. Even Abraham Lincoln got retroactive approval from Congress.
So the first question is the following. Is Kristi Noem just stupid and she doesn't know the law? There's a whole body of evidence that would suggest that that's the truth. But you notice in the later part of her answer that she says that the president has the ability to suspend habeas corpus. And so she lets the cat out of the bag that she does know what habeas corpus is. She just doesn't give a shit as to the legality of it. So I thought I'd take a few moments today to let us go back to law school, but I'll see the practical implications of why you should care about habeas corpus. So habeas corpus is also known as, quote, the great writ of liberty. And I'm going to put up a definition for you guys to check out right now because I think it's worth looking at. It's Latin for the phrase that you have the body. And here's the bottom line. If you want to be able to describe habeas corpus to your friends and your family and maybe some MAGA out there so they understand why this is important to them, habeas corpus is a constitutionally guaranteed right to all people. I'm not talking about just, quote, U.S. citizens, okay? Habeas corpus is the ability for a person to challenge their unlawful detention by the government. And so again, quote, that you have the body, that Latin phrase, that means why do you have the body? Justify why are you detaining someone? Can you imagine a time when you don't have that option? Well, the answer is yes. So let's go back in history just a little bit because I think it's worth us having this conversation. So, how far back are we going to go, folks? We're going to travel back in time to the Magna Carta days. This is going to be back in 1215. And it couldn't be any clearer than what I'm about to read to you right now. Quote, no man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. That's pretty damn clear language. That's the 39th clause of the Magna Carta signed by King John. So take a second and think about this. Even when we had a king, or even when there was a king, even the king said that habeas corpus made sense, that it was something that you had to show to be able to keep somebody in detention. And habeas corpus also developed for a way for a king to be able to demand an explanation as to why one of his subjects was being restrained of their liberties, by other authorities. Now, let's fast forward in time. Let's go to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court has recognized the constitutionality of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, called the Suspension Clause of the Constitution. And it says the following. The privileges of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Now, we're going to get to suspension in a minute, but the U.S. Supreme Court said, quote, the writ of habeas corpus is the fundamental instrument for safeguarding individual freedom against arbitrary and lawless state action. Sounds pretty on point for this administration, no less. And must be, quote, administered with the initiative and flexibility essential to ensure that miscarriages of justice within its reach are surfaced and corrected. I mean, I could not have written that any better than the United States Supreme Court. That was from Chief Justice Marshall back in 1830. So, not only is habeas corpus in the Constitution, remember that, but the United States Supreme Court has had the ability to address habeas corpus and has found that it has to exist. It has to be there to protect you, to protect me, even to protect MAGA, even if we don't think that they merit the protections. But let's move on, right? So there's a constitutional law professor at UC Berkeley, and I wanted to quote her on this issue because it just really underscored the importance of habeas corpus. She said it's, quote, her name is Amanda Tyler. We always have to give attribution, right? She said, quote, one of the single most foundational aspects of American law and the American Constitution is habeas corpus. I mean, it's a foundational right. The framers of the Constitution thought habeas corpus, even back then, was so important that it had to be included in the United States Constitution. And listen, it's very clear here as following. Only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. It is not anything that the President of the United States can do. The executive branch cannot do that. So let's also talk about why habeas corpus is such an important context or concept that is relevant as we have this conversation today. So why is the phrase habeas corpus so prevalent in the discourse the last few months? Well, like most things, we can place the blame squarely at the feet of convicted felon Donald Trump. Why? Because on March 15th, Donald Trump issued the following proclamation entitled, quote, Invocation of the Alien Enemies Act regarding the invasion of the United States by Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua is a gang in Venezuela, folks. And according to Donald Trump, he decided to take a 1798 statute. It's been used in very, very limited situations. And he basically said that there was an invasion against the United States by the gang Tren de Aragua. Now, we know about this. It was the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. It's for brevity, AEA, right? And so the president's proclamation by invoking the AEA has now been used as a blanket justification to be able to kidnap people from American soil and remove them into jurisdictions abroad, and to allow now the Department of Justice and the federal government under Donald Trump to say, sorry, we don't have jurisdiction over them because they're no longer on U.S. soil. So now habeas corpus has now been popping up because federal courts have said that habeas corpus is the relief. It is the way by which people that have been improperly detained by the federal government under Trump are able to seek their release from detention, because it forces the government to have to justify why they've detained these people in the first place. And remember how we talked about a few minutes ago that you don't have to be only a United States citizen to be able to invoke habeas corpus. There's nothing in the language of it that says you have to be a U.S. citizen. So when somebody tells you that you got to be a U.S. citizen to get habeas corpus, the answer is no, you're wrong. You tell them you heard from Katie Phang, who's a real lawyer, that you don't have to be a U.S. citizen. So now what ends up happening, though, is Donald Trump has made the following argument. He says that it is my role as the president to be able to say that the United States is at war or facing an invasion or predatory incursion, and that's within my exclusive jurisdiction or discretion, to be able to declare. But let me be very clear. Since the invocation of the AEA by Donald Trump in March of this year, in 2025, there have been at least 3 federal judges who have said that his invocation of the AEA has been improper. Why? Because they have not found that there has been an invasion or predatory incursion. Now, 3 judges. One is James Boasberg. We know him. He's a favorite of ours, DC District Court Chief Judge. He previously was the one who was holding the administration's feet to the fire to have them justify why they let planes take off and go to El Salvador, to that horrific prison, CCOT, and to take people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia and others. And so that is the judge in the DC District Court. And he said, quote, simply because a legal claim implicates foreign affairs or national security does not mean that the political question doctrine places it beyond judicial cognizance. So let's break this down, okay, folks? What he's saying is there is this idea that certain things by the executive should not be able to be questioned in court. Meaning, the executive should be able to do stuff within its discretion, and the judiciary should not be able to question it or challenge it in any way. So it ends up being something called a political question doctrine, meaning, can you take something that is within the purview of the executive and allow the judiciary to make a decision on whether or not it's proper or not? Trump has taken the position that I am the king. No thanks to Supreme Court, right? I am the king. I can make these declarations. We are at war, or we're being invaded, or there's a predatory incursion by Tren de Aragua. So I've invoked AEA, which means what? Which means I can just kidnap people and take them away. And now we have members of the judiciary that are brave and bold, and they're abiding by the rule of law, and they're saying, no, that is not the case. You cannot say that those decisions by the president are beyond the scope of a judicial, judicial review. Now, we don't have a declared war, folks. It's not like you slept through it and it happened. Congress has not declared war with Venezuela. 1. 2, there have now been declassified memos in the national security intel space that have revealed that despite what Trump, Marco Rubio, Kristi Noem, anybody wants to tell you, there is no evidence that Tren de Aragua, the gang in Venezuela, is being directed and controlled by the Maduro regime. The government in Venezuela is not controlling that gang. That government is not telling the gang to go in some type of invasion way into the United States to be able to wreak havoc, to run amok, and to commit criminal activity in the United States. Then there's another judge. There is a judge, and we have to give these people flowers, right? This is Judge Rodriguez in the Southern District of Texas. Judge Rodriguez has also found that the court retains authority to construe the Alien Enemies Act's terms and determine whether the announced basis for the proclamation properly invokes the statute. In other words, hey, Trump, you can't just say it's the AEA and you can't just kidnap people. Actually, we as judges, we have the ability to review what you've done. Then there's another judge, Judge Charlotte Sweeney in the District of Colorado. Judge Charlotte Sweeney wrote that the government asserting that the AEA, the preconditions to be able to invoke the AEA are satisfied. Well, you know what? The idea that we're not allowed to review that is, quote, nonsense. You gotta leave it up to a female judge to say it and succinctly in one word, nonsense. Now, we always present all the information to you here on this channel. There has been so far one judge. This is Judge Haynes in the Western District of Pennsylvania. Judge Haynes has said that presidents must make the case as to whether or not the AEA is invoked, but the courts are expected to trust that the president's statement is grounded in facts that perhaps we may not be able to see. Now, let's stop for a second. Let's be commonsensical here, right? Sure, maybe the president of the United States has access to information about which we don't know. That is very possible. But what did I just say a few minutes ago about how the Intel community and national security people have said, and analysts have said, there is no evidence of that. So in other words, Trump is lying. They're lying to you. Now, why do we talk about this AEA and why do we talk about habeas corpus? Well, it's because of this horrible person, Stephen Miller. Let's listen to what this guy said last week about the suspension of habeas corpus. Take a listen.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. At the end of the day,
Stephen Miller is a pretty bad guy, but the reason why we should care when Stephen Miller is saying, quote, the administration is actively looking at suspending habeas corpus, and it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. We got to break that down, people. Okay? And this is why. One, as we talked about, and as you guys have learned, Congress can suspend habeas corpus. It is not what the president can do unilaterally. Remember that. Number two, the reason why they want to suspend habeas corpus is because they understand the power of it. They know that it's a constitutionally guaranteed right. They know that it protects all of us, citizens or not, from unlawful detention. So if habeas corpus is suspended by the Trump administration, then they can round all of us up, take us somewhere like CCOT, not have to account for it. I am not being hyperbolic when I say this. This is why we need to understand these basic principles that are guaranteed to all of us so that we know how to fight back when they're threatening to suspend habeas corpus. And the last thing that Miller said that we have to pay attention to is whether or not, quote, it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. Hey, newsflash, Stephen Miller, it has nothing to do with whether or not the courts do it right or not. What is your definition of the right thing, Stephen Miller? The right thing is what you want it to be, but that's not how the Constitution was written, and that's not what it stands for. So when we have the judicial guardrails holding things together, we have to acknowledge that these are wins for democracy. These are pro-democracy moves. Here's another pro-democracy move that we saw happen just this past Friday. For those of you that have been following along, so there is a Supreme Court decision that was rendered on Friday in one of the immigration cases. And the Supreme Court said in its 7-2 opinion, the two being Alito and who else, Thomas, but nothing's new. And I want to show this to you guys so you guys can read along. This court explained, with all 9 justices agreeing, that AEA, Alien Enemies Act, detainees must receive notice that they are subject to removal under the act within a reasonable time in such a manner as will allow them to actually seek habeas relief before removal. In order to actually seek habeas relief, a detainee must have sufficient time and information to reasonably be able to contact counsel, file a petition, and pursue appropriate relief. I saw habeas relief at least twice in that section that we just read together. Why? Habeas relief is another way of saying habeas corpus relief. So, the Supreme Court of the United States, as recently as Friday, underscored that due process is to be afforded to all people, not just United States citizens. So again, if someone tries to tell you in MAGA land, in the land of Delulu, that these rights only belong to United States citizens, they're damn wrong. But I'm going to read it again. They are entitled to notice and the ability to challenge their removal. Under habeas relief, habeas corpus gives them the right to have a finding to be made by a judicial body like a judge, not Donald Trump, not Stephen Miller, not Kristi Noem, not Tom Homan. A judge gets to determine whether or not they are being appropriately removed pursuant to the Alien Enemies Act. It could not be any clearer. It is clear as freaking day. People, I wanted to have this conversation with you today because listen, I know that this thing with Kristi Noem was yesterday, but you know what? This administration is making up definitions as they go along. They're making up the law as they go along. And it may be frustrating, but these are lies. And we have an obligation to call them out as they happen. These are lies. These conversations you and I are having, this is how we educate ourselves. Knowledge is power. We take this knowledge, we spread it to other people, and we have them understand that the law doesn't say what Donald Trump wants it to say. It does not get twisted and contorted and perverted to meet their agenda and their narrative. And because you know what habeas corpus is, then you are better off, as am I, as am others. I always like to say, be mad, be outraged, and demand accountability. You have the right to be mad. You have the right to be outraged, and you certainly have the right to demand accountability. That's what we are doing here at the Katie Phang News Channel. That's what we're doing anywhere you see justice and pro-democracy resistance happening. I'll catch you on the other side. Katie Phang here. The truth matters now more than ever. So hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for watching.